Oh, back in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Close. Close. Mother called Rose Kennedy. At 3:00 p.m., President Johnson asked one of his aides to get in touch with Rose Kennedy, President Kennedy's mother. Here's the conversation. You do not have to write it down. Lyndon Johnson gets on the phone. She answers the phone. He says, "Mrs. Kennedy." She replies, "Yes, Mr. President." How about that? Rose Kennedy replies, "Yes, Mr. President." How classy is she when you think about it, okay? This is at 3:00 in the afternoon in which her son was brutally assassinated. She answers, "Yes, Mr. President." Lyndon Johnson says, "I wish to God there was something that I could do, and I want to tell you that we're grieving with you." Mrs. Kennedy says, "Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I know you love Jack and he loved you." Well, President Johnson was kind of a jackass at times, very persuasive jerk at times, tears up and cannot talk on the phone anymore. So who's he hand the phone to? No? His wife, Lady Bird. Close. He becomes very emotional and has to give the telephone to Lady Bird Johnson, who continues the conversation by saying, "We are glad that the nation had your son as long as it did." And Rose Kennedy responded by saying, "Yes, well, thank you, Lady Bird. Thank you very much. Goodbye." And Lady Bird ends the conversation with, "Love and prayers to all of you." Why doesn't Mrs. Kennedy show any emotion? Well, she's a Kennedy, and the old Kennedy creed is Kennedys don't cry. You don't show emotion, it shows weakness. You'll always see that in the family. Well, finally, at 6 p.m., and now we're changing a little bit of a time zone. All this other stuff has been Central Standard Time. At 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, because that's where we're going to be, Air Force One lands at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. At 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Air Force One lands at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. And another interesting thing happens. Who's there to meet the aircraft? Nope, Bobby Kennedy. And he immediately boards the aircraft when it lands. And he pushes his way to the back of the plane where who is seated? Jackie. Just as fast as he can gets on the plane and virtually pushes his way to the back of the airplane where Jackie was seated. He pushed right by the new president and didn't even look up to acknowledge him. Didn't even look up to acknowledge the new president of the United States. Just pushed his way right to the back. Now, it was Lyndon Johnson's plan that he and Mrs. Kennedy would exit the aircraft together with the body of the slain president. That was his idea. That's, I guess, kind of politically correct. Well, Bobby Kennedy wasn't having any part of it, and this was a snub that President Johnson would never forget the remainder of his life. So Bobby wanted no part of that. So a lift truck, and you'll see this on video later, a lift truck edges up to the open door of the aircraft, and the bronze casket bearing the body of President Kennedy is unloaded off of Air Force One onto that elevated platform, and then it'll be down and it'll be put into a waiting hearse. Ambulance, actually, not a hearse, sorry. So the president's casket was lowered down from Air Force One. It was placed in an ambulance, and it was taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital for what? For the autopsy. Who got in the ambulance with the president's body? Jackie and Bobby. No Lyndon Johnson. He's sat there he's just kind of there holding the bag. Okay? So the president's casket was placed in an ambulance along with Robert and Jackie Kennedy and was taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital for the autopsy. Now, the reason it was chosen for the autopsy is because that's where President Kennedy, that was his official hospital. And Bethesda Naval Hospital was because he was in the Navy. So that was his official hospital during his presidency. So that's why the body was taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital for the autopsy. Well, what did Johnson do after this snub? He leaves the aircraft with Lady Bird and his entourage, and at 6:10 p.m., Lyndon Johnson gives his first public speech as President of the United States. At 6:10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Lyndon Johnson gives his first public speech as President of the United States. And this is what he said. You don't have to write it down. He said, "This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's." That's the speech he gave. Meanwhile, just a little side note, back on Air Force One, remember the flight steward we talked about, John Hames? He has the responsibility of collecting all of President Kennedy's effects and removing them from the aircraft, putting them in several boxes and sending them on to the White House. Why? Because he's no longer the president. And all of his personal belongings that he had on Air Force One were collected by him and taken to the White House, because Lyndon Johnson's going to be moving in, so to speak, to Air Force One. Okay, I'm going to show you several videos here, and I think you'll like them, and we'll finish the day with that. The first one I'm going to show you has to do with Cecil Stoughton. And who is he again? The guy that took the picture, right? Now you guys, I think, kind of make fun of me because of all this memorabilia I have on my walls.